If you've seen the documentary Essex Boys The Truth from 2015, you would have seen Barry Dorman talking about his friendship with Patrick Tate. Also, Barry talks about the trip to Ostend, where Michael Steele exchanged the money back to Patrick Tate for the dud cannabis. Also, Barry mentioning what happened to the Range Rover after the murders. Barry Dorman was arrested just 6 hours after the official discovery of the Range Rover by farmers Peter Fearbold and Ken Jiggins. He was arrested by armed police alongside Graham Law and Ian Redding after a tip-off. The following is the statement of Barry Dorman. I'm the above-named person and I live at the address Overleaf with my daughter. I lived at this address for the last 16 years. About 18 to 19 years ago, I was working as a shift engineer at Tunnel Refineries, Greenwich. At this time, I was buying and selling cars in my spare time, and as a result, I met a man called Patrick Tate. At this time, Pat was living in Pitsea, and he was about 19 to 20 years old. My contact with Pat continued as I started to see him attending car auctions. As a result of this, we continued our contact on a friendly business basis, but our contact was limited to dealing in second-hand cars. About 11 years ago, I had a serious car accident, and as a result of my injuries, I had to give up my job at Tunnel Refineries. After about a year, as a result of my continued contact with Pat Tate, it was suggested by him that I tried the second-hand car trade full-time. It was through Pat that I managed to acquire the rented forecourt located at the junction of the old A13 and One Tree Hill. At this time, the garage was called Eastern Garage, and the forecourt was a separate entity alongside. I took up the forecourt with my cousin, Stephen Dillon, who was already a car trader in London. We named the forecourt Cousins Cars and began trading in 1985. My contact with Patrick Tate increased as he was running another car front on Canvey Island called Beach Autos. My contact with Pat was still limited to a friendly business basis. After about 5 years, my cousin and I had a big falling out, and as a result we parted company. I continued to trade and was joined at the site by a man called Graham Law, who at the time was also trading from the Five Bells roundabout site on the A13. After a period of time, the two garages amalgamated as Eastern Garage Car Sales, and I ran the Five Bells site and Graham ran the One Tree Hill site. We have continued like this to date. At about this time, I became aware that Patrick Tate had become involved with the police in respect to some criminal matter and that he was in custody. I can remember being contacted by his girlfriend Sarah Saunders, who told me that the police had seized about £20,000 from Pat, which they believed was drug-related money. It was the first time it was mentioned that Pat may be involved in the dealing of drugs, although I'd been aware that Pat took or used cocaine himself. I have known Sarah Saunders for many years, as her grandmother lived very near to my own house. She asked me to help Pat by showing that the money was related to car dealing, not drug dealing, and to do this she asked me to find out all the car invoices which related to car trades between Pat and myself. I did this and handed them to Sarah, and as a result I was required to attend Chelmsford Crown Court at a later date to give evidence at Pat's trial. I was later told by Sarah that Pat had been convicted of robbery and had been sentenced to a long term of imprisonment. Whilst Pat was in prison, he contacted me, and as a result I went to visit him at a prison in Kent. He asked me to sort out a vehicle for Sarah Saunders, which I agreed to do. I also visited Pat one other time when he phoned and asked me to go and see him. My next contact with Pat was when I was invited to Pat's release party at Sarah Saunders' mother's address. At this party, I was introduced to a person by the name of Steve Ellis by Pat, as well as a number of friends and family. I can also remember spending time with a man I know as Bill Baxter. I knew Bill Baxter through the car trade, and I knew that Bill had some involvement with Pat in respect of a car front in Southend. Bill Baxter now runs the car front opposite Nova Car Sales on the London Road Leigh-on-Sea, and I believe Pat Tate still has a financial involvement with Bill Baxter. After the party, I can remember Steve Ellis and Pat coming down to my car site with a view to Steve buying a vehicle. At this time, I can remember that Steve Ellis having about £7,000 in cash to spend. To my recollection, this would have been about 18 months ago. Ellis did not buy a vehicle from me, but I knew he had originally come to me on Pat's recommendations. My contact with Pat continued as before, with reasonable regular contact through the trade and the sale of a number of vehicles to Pat. I would describe my relationship with Pat as friendly, although we did not socialise outside of work. It was around this sort of time that Pat started talking about a man called Tony Tucker, who he said he'd met at a nightclub where Tony was working as a doorman. I had never met Tony, but I can remember Pat talking about him. It was around this time that I was told that Pat had been shot and he was in Basildon Hospital. I went to the hospital with Graham Law to see Pat, and when I was there, Pat's brother Russell turned up. Although I had known Russell as a car trader, I've had very little to do with him. We only stayed with Pat for about 10 minutes, as I merely wanted to let him know that I'd heard and passed on my good wishes. Although I had this regular contact with Pat and we'd built up a trust between us, he never told me any details of what is involved in other than to do with cars. As he knew, I'd previously been in the Metropolitan Police Service for a short period, and I was also wary of Pat and his volatile temperament. I was always careful of what I asked Pat in case he thought I was trying to get information from him. I was later told that the man I'd met at Pat's party, Steve Ellis, was possibly involved in the shooting, although I do not know whether there is any truth in this. I have never asked Pat about the shooting or any other business, as I know he would be suspicious of my reasons. I later became aware that the police had found a number of items in Pat's possession at hospital, and as a result, he was returned to prison. I believe the items included a handgun, a quantity of cocaine, and some tablets. I did not go and see Pat in prison, but I was asked by Pat through Sarah Saunders to dispose of his current vehicle, which was a black Porsche. I took possession of this vehicle from Sarah, and after having some work done on it, I put it up for sale on my front for about £8,995. When I had the car, I received a phone call from Pat in prison telling me to keep the money if I sold the car and not to give it to Sarah or anybody else. I had the vehicle for a couple of months, and during this time I took 2 deposits on the car, but the sales fell through. When I took the deposits, I used to put a sold sign on the vehicle, and when I did this, I received a visit from a man called Tony Tucker. At this time, I think I'd met Tucker once or twice when he attended the car front with Pat before he was returned to prison. When he came to my garage, Tucker told me to give him the money whilst Pat was in prison. Although I had heard about Tony Tucker and I did not want to cross him, I was more concerned about crossing Pat, and therefore I told Tony I would not give him the money. When I stood my ground, I told him what Pat had said. Tony seemed to accept it and left my garage. I kept the car for a couple of months but could not sell it. I therefore returned it to Sarah Saunders. In this time, I only saw Tony Tucker once more when he came up to my car front on a horse and asked me if I'd had any luck selling it. At this time, I had become aware of Tony moving into a house in Fobbin High Road with a large plot of land. I had a couple of phone calls from Pat whilst he was in prison, but they appeared to be merely for a chat rather than anything specific. The next time I saw Pat was when he came down to my car front after he'd been released from prison. This was at the end of October 1995, the beginning of November. At this time he was on his own, and we had a general chat about domestic and general matters. At this time he appeared quite level-headed and normal. My next contact with Pat and Tony Tucker was when they came to my garage after Pat had had an accident in Tony's black Porsche. The vehicle was badly damaged, and Pat was asking me to sort it out as cheaply as possible. The vehicle was brought to the One Tree Hill site. My daughter spent a lot of time trying to locate cheap second-hand spares for the repair. I also arranged for quotes to carry out the bodywork. As a result of the Porsche repairs, I began to have virtual day-to-day contact with either Pat, Tony or both. The majority of the time they were together, and with a younger man called Craig. At that time I had a blue Range Rover Vogue SE on my forecourt, as I'd recently taken it in as a part exchange. I had purchased this vehicle on the 2nd of the 11th 95. As Tony Tucker was now without a vehicle, he and Pat showed interest in purchasing the Range Rover, which I had for sale at £10,995. After some negotiation, I agreed to sell it to them for £9,800, but I knew that neither Pat or Tony would be able to get finance on the vehicle. When I pointed this out, Tony stated that his friend would be buying it on his behalf and he would be using it. I agreed to accept a £2,000 deposit and put the remainder on finance. A friend of Tony's, a man he gave his name as Mr. P. Cuthbert, then attended my site and provided sufficient details for me to complete the finance agreement. I was handed £2,000 in cash at that time, but I was unable to say which one of them gave it to me. Then they took the keys from me and drove the vehicle away from my forecourt. I completed a sales invoice for the transaction and showed the purchaser as Tony Tucker. I can produce a copy of this invoice as an exhibit. I then sent off the completed finance agreement and received my cheque from the company for the balance. I am still in possession of the registration document for the vehicle, which I can produce as exhibit B2D3. The finance company would have issued a pay-in book to Mr. P. Cuthbert to enable the monthly payments to be made. This book would have been sent to Cuthbert's home address. The Range Rover was taken by Pat and Tony on the 14th of the 11th 95. From that day, when Pat, Tony and Craig visited my car front, they would be using the Range Rover. Craig would normally be the driver, with Pat in the front passenger seat and Tony in the back. As stated, I had a number of visits from them inquiring about the progress with the Porsche repairs. I can remember during one of the visits, Tony was really annoyed and stated they were trying to link him to the supply of the ecstasy tablet which killed the girl called Leah Betts. He stated that he knew who had supplied it, as he'd been told by one of his doormen. He also stated that he had made some checks and he knew that the girl regularly took tablets and that she didn't even live with her father. He was really ranting and raving to Pat about it, and I heard him say that it was only because their dad was a policeman that such a fuss was being made. During the morning of Wednesday the 6th of December 95, I was at the car front when Pat, Tony, Craig and Mr. Pete Cuthbert arrived in the Range Rover. I would describe Cuthbert as male, white, 5'10" to 5'11", late 30s, reasonably fit build. I have been told he is a ceiling fixer. The four of them came into the office and I was handed by one of them the pay-in book relating to the Range Rover finance. And between them they produced £321.40 in cash. I was asked by one of them, I can't remember who, to keep the book and to remind them when the payments were due. I agreed to do this as it was in my interest to make sure the finance was paid. I'd also been told by Pat and Tony at the time of purchasing the vehicle that they intended to pay it off in one lump sum fairly quickly. I paid this sum into my Barclays Bank at Pitsea Broadway the following day. I can produce the pay-in book as my exhibit B2D4. Sometime during an earlier meet with Pat, he had asked me whether I had a suitable vehicle for him to give to Sarah Saunders. He told me there had been a lot of problems between them and he wanted to give her a car to get her off his back. I had told him I had a VW Passat on the forecourt, which I'd taken in as a part exchange on the 25th of November 95. I showed him the vehicle, which was metallic green in colour. He agreed to take it for a test drive and we later agreed on a price of £1,800 for the vehicle. I can produce a purchase invoice for this VW Passat as my exhibit B2D5. I left my garage forecourt around 5 to 5:30 on Wednesday the 6th of December 95, intending to play my friend Keith Moore at squash. At this time my daughter and an employee, Mickey Stenning, were at the car front. En route to squash, I received a phone call from Mickey Stenning stating that Herc, which is my pet name for Pat Tate, i.e. short for Hercules due to his size, had arrived at the car front to collect the VW Passat. Pat then came onto the phone and told me he would still take the vehicle even though he didn't need it, as he'd had a bust-up with Sarah Saunders. I told him that he didn't have to take it, but he insisted that he would. He told me he'd pay me for the vehicle in the morning as he had a lump of money coming. As a result, I agreed to Pat taking the vehicle that night, which he did. The following morning, Thursday the 7th of December 95, I returned to my car site around 9 a.m. Between 11 a.m. and 12 midday, I was at the site talking to a customer when a female approached me and called me by my name, i.e. Bao. I did not recognise her, and as I was talking, she appeared to move away. A short while later, I returned to the office and the same woman approached me and said words to the effect of, "Bao, can they trace that Range Rover back to you?" Not knowing her, I said, "What Range Rover?" And she replied, "The one that Tony's been using." At that, I realised she was referring to the Range Rover being used by Patrick Tate and Tony Tucker. I asked her why, and she replied, "Oh, nothing." She then walked out of the office. I described this woman as female, white, 5'3", slim build, tan freckled face with mousy straight hair. I believe that she's the girlfriend of Tony Tucker. I was obviously concerned about why she'd come in and asked that question, so I immediately tried to contact Pat Tate on his mobile telephone. When I called the number, I got no reply, so I tried his other mobile telephone. When this was answered by a female, who I did not recognise, I asked to speak to the big man, and she said he was out on a job. I asked if everything was alright, and she said yeah. I then tried to phone Tony on his mobile, and all I got was Tony's answer phone. I did not leave a message. I then tried to phone Tony's home number, but that was unattainable. I have not seen Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, Craig or Mr. Cuthbert since. Purely as background information, I am aware that Pat, Tony and Craig were heavily into bodybuilding, and in their quest to increase their size were injecting substances. I believe that all three of them used the Progress gym for an hour each morning.